Let me tell you about a Tuesday in Egypt. It was 1888. A British archaeologist named Flinders Petrie was elbow-deep in a mummy cartonnage. That's the papier-mâché-like casing they used to wrap the dead. He was working near a place called Hawara in the Fayum region of Egypt. And inside the wrapping of a corpse that had been sealed for nearly 2,000 years, he pulled out something that stopped him cold. It wasn't gold, it wasn't a cursed tablet, it wasn't some mystical scroll about the afterlife. It was Homer. Specifically, fragments of the Iliad, one of the greatest epic poems in all of human history, written in Greek on papyrus, pressed into the chest cavity of an Egyptian mummy like someone had used it as packing material. Now on the surface you might think, okay, that's a bit strange but probably explainable. And you'd be right, there is an explanation. But that explanation, that perfectly reasonable, historically documented explanation, is actually more disturbing than the mystery itself. Because once you understand why Homer was inside that mummy, it opens a door to a much bigger question. A question about what else has been found in places it shouldn't be, what else sits in museum storage rooms right now, quietly reclassified, quietly shelved, what ancient knowledge was recorded, preserved, and then somehow buried with the dead. Stay with me, because this goes deeper than you think. Let's start with the facts, because the facts are wild enough on their own. The Fayum region of Egypt, about 60 miles southwest of Cairo, was during the Greco-Roman period home to a thriving multicultural population. After Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BC, and after his general Ptolemy took control of the country, something remarkable happened. Greek culture and Egyptian culture didn't just coexist, they fused. Greek-speaking Egyptians began adopting local burial customs. They mummified their dead the way ancient Egyptians had for thousands of years, but they wrapped those bodies in materials pulled from their own daily lives, including literature. The papyrus fragments used in mummy cartonnage weren't blank, they were recycled. Old tax records, personal letters, legal documents, contracts, and yes, books, literary texts, poetry. And Homer was everywhere. In fact, the Iliad is one of the single most well-represented texts in the entire corpus of ancient Egyptian papyri ever recovered. Scholars have identified hundreds of separate Iliad fragments pulled from Egyptian mummies, tomb fills, and ancient rubbish heaps across the Fayum. Think about what that means. Homer's Iliad, written or compiled sometime around the 8th century BC, set during the legendary Trojan War, sung by blind poets across the Greek world, had become so common in Greco-Roman Egypt that people literally used it as stuffing for corpses. It was the ancient world's equivalent of wrapping a moving box in newspaper, except the newspaper was one of the greatest literary achievements in Western civilization. Now, here is where the story gets uncomfortable. Because Petrie wasn't the last one to find these, dozens of expeditions followed. The Oxyrhynchus excavations, led by Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt starting in 1896, recovered hundreds of thousands of papyrus fragments from a garbage dump in Middle Egypt. A garbage dump. And in that garbage dump, they found fragments of plays by Sophocles that had been lost for 2 millennia, fragments of lost gospels, astronomical texts, medical treatises, private correspondence from ordinary people living 2,000 years ago. Most of it has still not been fully translated or published. Let me say that again, slowly. The Oxyrhynchus papyri were excavated in 1896. We are now more than a century later, and scholars estimate that less than 2% of those fragments have been formally published. Less than 2%. Where is the rest? Sitting in boxes, in Oxford, in Cairo, in museums and university archives around the world, waiting. So now I want to pull back, wide angle. Because what happened with Homer in Egypt is not an anomaly, it is a pattern, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Throughout history, repeatedly, consistently, ancient knowledge has been found in places that make no logical sense. In tombs, in walls, in wells, wrapped around bodies, buried under churches, hidden in jars in caves. And the question nobody seems to want to ask is this: why does knowledge keep ending up buried? Let's run through the evidence. Case 1, the Dead Sea Scrolls. 1947. A Bedouin shepherd named Mohammed Ed-Dihib is looking for a lost goat near the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. He throws a rock into a cave, hears something shatter. Inside, clay jars, inside the jars, scrolls, wrapped in linen. What he found, and what excavations over the following decade continued to find in 11 separate caves, was a library. A hidden library, deliberately concealed, containing some of the oldest known manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible, as well as texts that had been entirely unknown to modern scholarship. The community that hid them, almost certainly the Essenes, a Jewish sect, buried their entire intellectual inheritance in the desert rather than let it fall into Roman hands. Some of those texts described theological ideas, cosmologies, and ritual practices that completely rewrote our understanding of Second Temple Judaism. They suggested the development of early Christianity was far more complex, far more diverse, and far stranger than we had been taught. The Vatican requested access to certain scroll fragments almost immediately. It took decades for the full content to be made publicly available. Decades. I'm about to reveal the secret source, but if you want more reveals like this, hit subscribe right now. Case 2, the Nag Hammadi Library. Same era, different desert. 1945, just 2 years before the Dead Sea Scrolls. An Egyptian farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman was digging for fertilizer near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt when his mattock hit a sealed clay jar. Inside, 13 leather-bound books called codices, containing 52 texts written in Coptic. These were Gnostic Gospels, texts that had been declared heretical by the early church and systematically destroyed: the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth, the Apocryphon of John. Texts that showed a version of early Christianity almost unrecognizable from the institutional version that survived. One of the codices was partially burned by the farmer's mother to use as kindling. Knowledge that had survived sealed in a jar for 1600 years, gone in a kitchen fire. The texts that survived were purchased on the black market, passed between scholars, fought over by governments, and only fully published by the late 1970s. Think about that timeline, found in 1945, fully published in the 1970s, 30 years. Case 3, the Antikythera mechanism. 1901, Greek sponge divers surface from a Roman-era shipwreck off the island of Antikythera. Among the statues and wine amphorae and bronze artifacts they pull up is a corroded, barnacle-encrusted lump of metal. For 50 years, nobody knows what it is. Then a physicist named Derek de Solla Price starts X-raying it, and what he finds inside makes the scientific community go quiet. It is a mechanical computer, gears within gears within gears, 37 interlocking bronze components capable of tracking the solar calendar, the lunar calendar, the cycles of eclipses, the positions of the planets known to antiquity, all simultaneously. Built around 100 BC. The mechanism is more mechanically sophisticated than anything we have record of for the next 1400 years. Nothing remotely comparable appears in the archaeological record until the astronomical clocks of medieval Europe. Where did this technology come from? Who built it? Are there others? We don't know. We have one, found at the bottom of the sea, by accident. Case 4, the Baghdad Battery. 1936. An Iraqi archaeologist named Wilhelm Koenig is working in the Baghdad Museum when he notices something in the storage collection, a small clay jar about 5 inches tall. Inside, a copper cylinder. Inside that, an iron rod. The whole assembly is sealed with asphalt. Koenig makes a hypothesis that gets him laughed out of serious archaeology for decades. He says it's a battery. Experiments conducted in the 1940s, and repeatedly since, confirm that when filled with an acidic liquid like vinegar or grape juice, the device produces approximately 1.1 volts of electricity. It dates to the Parthian period, roughly 250 BC to 224 AD. Nobody in mainstream archaeology has a convincing explanation for what it was used for. The official position, largely, is to call it a storage vessel and move on. Now, I am not here to tell you the ancient world had electricity the way we do. I am not here to tell you aliens built the pyramids, or that there's a secret civilization under Antarctica. I am here to tell you something much simpler and much more verifiable. The things we know have been found, the documented discoveries, sitting in museums, published in journals, are already extraordinary enough to demand that we ask harder questions. And the harder question is this: if this is what they found by accident, what have they found on purpose and kept quiet? Let's talk about what we know is out there right now, today, that has not been released. And I want to be precise here, this is not speculation, These are documented facts about documented collections. The Vatican Apostolic Archive. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, formerly known as the Vatican Secret Archive, renamed in 2019 in what many scholars read as a public relations move, contains approximately 53 miles of shelving. 53 miles. It holds documents stretching back to the 8th century AD. It contains correspondence between popes and emperors, trial records, diplomatic communications, and an unknown quantity of texts acquired by the Church throughout its 2,000-year history, including texts gathered during periods of aggressive acquisition of libraries, monasteries, and conquered territories. Scholars are granted access, some access, carefully curated, supervised, pre-selected access. The archive did not fully open documents from the Inquisition period until 1998. Documents from Pope Pius XII's wartime papacy covering the Holocaust were only made accessible in 2020. What is the timeline on the rest? Nobody outside the Vatican can answer that question. The Egyptian Museum storage. The Egyptian Museum in Cairo currently has more items in storage than it has on display, vastly more. Estimates suggest that for every artifact in a display case, dozens, possibly hundreds, remain in storage, catalogued at various levels of detail, awaiting study. When the Grand Egyptian Museum near Giza began preparing for its opening, curators discovered artifacts in the old Cairo museum storage that had not been formally examined since they were first excavated, in some cases over a century ago. One storage area reportedly contained over 100,000 objects. 100,000 objects, a significant portion of them uninspected by modern scholars. The unexplored tombs. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the Valley of the Kings have consistently revealed anomalies, cavities, chambers, sealed spaces that have not been excavated. In 2015, infrared thermography scans of Tutankhamun's tomb suggested the presence of 2 hidden chambers behind plastered walls, potentially containing undisturbed burials. The Egyptian government announced investigations, then the investigations stalled, then the consensus among the geological teams began to fracture, then the story quietly faded from news cycles. The walls have never been opened. The chambers, if they exist, have never been entered. The Herculaneum Papyri. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD, it buried not just Pompeii but the neighboring town of Herculaneum. And in Herculaneum, excavations in the 1700s uncovered a villa, now called the Villa of the Papyri, containing an entire private library. Approximately 1,800 papyrus scrolls, carbonized by the volcanic heat into fragile black cylinders. For 200 years, most of those scrolls were considered unreadable, too fragile to unroll, too damaged to decipher. Then, in 2023, using advanced X-ray tomography and artificial intelligence, a team of researchers managed to read significant portions of one scroll for the first time. It was a text by the philosopher Philodemus discussing the nature of pleasure. But here is the part that should make every book lover and every historian's hands shake. That villa belonged to someone. Scholars believe it belonged to Julius Caesar's father-in-law, and the library we found, the 1,800 scrolls, is almost certainly not the complete collection. Those were the scrolls in one room, the basement, the room that survived. The rest of the villa, including what scholars believe was a Greek-language library on the upper floors, was destroyed or remains unexcavated. We may be standing above lost works of Aristotle, Sappho, Euripides, and dozens of authors known only by name, right now. Right now, the ground holds them. I want to address the question I can already hear forming in your head. Okay, but so what? What does it change if we find a lost play by Sophocles? How does that affect my life? And it's a fair question, let me answer it. First, knowledge compounds. The ancient world was not primitive in the way we are sometimes taught to imagine. The Library of Alexandria, before it was burned, before its collection was systematically dispersed, reportedly held between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls, works of medicine, mathematics, astronomy, engineering, philosophy, history. Most of that knowledge was lost. And when it was lost, civilization didn't just pause, it went backwards, for centuries. The fall of Rome plunged Europe into a period where life expectancy dropped, cities shrank, literacy collapsed, and technologies like concrete, indoor plumbing, and underfloor heating disappeared from European life for over 1,000 years. That is what happens when knowledge is lost. Now imagine the inverse. Imagine if we found, intact, readable, translatable, the complete medical works of Galen, the lost engineering texts of Ctesibius, the astronomical records of the ancient Egyptian priests who apparently tracked planetary cycles with terrifying accuracy for millennia. We are not just talking about academic interest, we are talking about compressed centuries of potential human development. Second, it changes who we think we are. Every time one of these discoveries is made, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Nag Hammadi texts, the Antikythera mechanism, the story of human history gets more complicated, more interesting, and less convenient for the version of events that institutions prefer. The Nag Hammadi texts revealed that early Christianity was far more diverse and far more suppressed than official church history admits. The Dead Sea Scrolls rewrote the timeline of biblical text transmission. The Antikythera mechanism forces us to revise our understanding of ancient Greek technological capacity. Every one of these discoveries was resisted, delayed, controlled, fought over. Not by cartoonish villains twirling mustaches, but by institutions, universities, governments, religious authorities, museums that have a structural interest in maintaining the version of history they were built on. That is not a conspiracy theory, that is bureaucracy, that is funding, that is careers and reputations and the very human tendency to resist information that invalidates your life's work. But the effect is the same. Knowledge gets delayed, suppressed, buried again, this time not in a clay jar in a desert cave, but in a filing system in Oxford, or a storage room in Cairo, or a restricted archive in Vatican City. So let's come back to where we started. A British archaeologist in 1888, standing in the Egyptian desert, pulling Homer's Iliad out of a mummy's chest cavity. That moment, ridiculous, impossible sounding, completely real, is a perfect metaphor for the entire situation we find ourselves in. The knowledge is there, it's always been there, in the wrapping of the dead, in the garbage dump of a Roman city, in a jar in a cave, in a shipwreck on the seafloor, in a carbonized cylinder under 16 feet of volcanic ash. It's there. The question, the only question that matters, is who controls the moment of discovery, who controls the publication, who decides what gets translated, what gets displayed, what gets highlighted in a press release, and what gets quietly shelved and relabeled as administrative material of uncertain provenance. Because here's the thing about the Oxyrhynchus papyri, those hundreds of thousands of fragments in Oxford and Cairo, that I want to leave you with. New technology has changed everything. Multispectral imaging, infrared photography, artificial intelligence-assisted text recognition, machine learning trained on known Greek and Coptic scripts. The tools now exist to process, raid, and publish those fragments at a speed that would have been unimaginable 20 years ago. Projects are underway, volunteers are transcribing, progress is being made. And in the last few years alone, in just the last few years, scholars have recovered fragments of lost plays, lost poems, lost medical texts. One fragment identified in 2021 appears to be a previously unknown work by Sappho, the Greek lyric poet, adding verses to a poem we thought we only had in pieces. Sappho writing found in a mummy, published in 2021. This is happening right now, in real time. The past is actively being recovered. But it raises the question, the one I keep coming back to, the one I think you should carry with you when you leave this video. For every fragment that's being digitized and published and celebrated, how many are still in a box? How many have been seen by exactly one curator, one librarian, one archivist who wrote 3 words on a tag and moved on to the next item? How many texts describe medicines we haven't invented, mathematical relationships we haven't discovered, histories of civilizations we don't believe existed? We don't know. And the most extraordinary, maddening, beautiful, infuriating thing about that answer is this. The information is almost certainly findable. It's sitting somewhere, in a labeled box, on a numbered shelf, waiting for someone to open it. Homer was wrapped around a corpse for 2,000 years. He survived. That's the thing about knowledge. It is extraordinarily hard to kill. It finds a way. In mummies, in caves, in garbage dumps, in carbonized scrolls and clay jars and the bottom of the sea. It waits. The question is whether we are in a hurry enough to go looking. If this video made you feel the way I hope it did, a little unsettled, a little more curious, and a lot more suspicious of the phrase we don't know, then share it. The algorithm buries content that doesn't get engagement in the first hour. You literally help keep this kind of information from being buried the same way the scrolls were. Subscribe if you want more of this. I go deep on the things that don't make the textbooks. Links to the sources I pulled from today are in the description, including the Oxyrhynchus digitization project, which you can actually volunteer for if you want to help recover lost ancient texts. I'm serious, they need help. You could personally recover a lost work of ancient literature. That's a real thing you can do. I'll see you in the next one.